Sarah is a executive coach and she's got a really cool title, which she's going to tell you about in a minute. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Sarah. Way!
Thanks very much, Elliot. Most conversations are simply monologues delivered in the presence of a witness. That was a quote from Margaret Miller, who's she's an American mystery writer, but I love it because it points to the thing that I'm talking about today, which is at a time that we are more able to connect than ever before. We have more means of connecting and talking to and being in conversation with people. We're actually losing the art of conversation. We're losing the art of connection. And this is a problem all over the place, right? We see it at work. I have a few statistics for you. So in the workplace, 33%, 1/3 of employees say a lack of open, honest communication has the most negative impact on morale. 27% of employees who plan to leave within the first year of a role cite being disconnected, feeling disconnected to their organization. And 99% of employees prefer a workplace where issues are transparently and honestly and truthfully discussed. And yet only, I think, less than 50% actually feel like they exist within an organization that does that. So there's a problem. And I see the problem that manifests around this conversation and communication. It comes up through a lack of regular feedback because we're not willing or we feel uncomfortable doing it, so we don't give it. It comes up as a sort of superficial connection with the people we work with rather than a deeper relationship. How many of us get surprised when a work colleague or someone we know professionally suddenly shares something that's going on for them? We had no idea any of that was happening before. I think some employees, it manifests as not feeling seen or heard, or really listened to. They're sort of their voices in the organization and not really heard. And it has consequences, right? It limits collaboration. It limits innovation. I find it really interesting that companies like Dyson have really specifically looked to bring back their innovation teams in to work face-to-face as early as possible, because they know that that communication and that connection and interaction is so important. But how many of us, where we're in a company where innovation isn't at the heart of it, but we're missing out because we're not having those conversations, we're not really connecting, we're not having the conversations that make a difference. And I think it also has a big consequence in terms of relationships. Now, this can be personal relationships. Another statistic for you. Of the reasons for divorce, communication problems are cited in 65% of cases. There's something wrong with our conversations, people. We're not having them. Equally, 45% of adults feel occasionally, sometimes, or often lonely. Now, that's a statistic for England, but that equates to 20 million people. That's an epidemic, a different epidemic, but they say loneliness is as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of its impact on health. So this has real world consequences. Fewer conversations, human to human, that have depth, that physical and mental health impact. Surface level or kind of performative conversations. You know, we all know and we blame social media for that, right? But where are we having the conversations that have meaning? So what all of this, I believe, has in common is our unwillingness or not having the ability to have the conversations that matter, the conversations that make a difference to people. So that's what I want to talk about today, because I'm on a mission to change that. Now, who am I to tell you about all of this, right? What do I know? So my name's Sarah Langslow. I'm an executive coach and a leadership development specialist. So my career started in elite sport, in rowing. I was a rower in the boat race, trialing for Team GB. And that taught me a lot about the importance of clear and direct feedback. It also taught me about working in an environment where emotions run really high. and both the positives and the challenges of that in terms of these conversations. From there, I went into a 15-year corporate career in consulting and in finance, was in senior leadership positions in both. There, I really learned the cost of not having these conversations, both personally and for the businesses and organizations that I was in. And ultimately, that was part of the reason that I left. Part of the reason that I didn't stay in that environment was some of those conversations weren't happening. And so now, as a professional certified coach, I've worked with hundreds of individuals to develop the power and the impact of their communication and their conversations as leaders, to help them through those conversations really make lasting change, to really make a difference for the teams, the organizations, and the people they work with by the way they connect and communicate and converse with them. And I also walk the talk on this. I'm a leader in a coaching and leadership development program based in New York, where we see it as transforming lives one conversation at a time, really having the conversations that other people are not willing to have. So what do I mean when I say a conversation that makes a difference, right? Everybody probably hears something different. There's a few different characteristics. So the first one, they're conversations that move us forwards. And what I mean by that is it could be that some action is taken. It could be that something is made or created. It could just be that there's a shift in behavior or in perception, or maybe a shift in relationship. The second characteristic, they tend to feel difficult. Now, I debated about this one because I thought, well, maybe when we get practice, maybe they don't always feel difficult. But typically, these are conversations where we're grappling with hard issues, often conflict, disagreement. They're often emotionally charged or complex, or they feel significant, like something often when we're really expressing, showing our opinion, that feels hard. The third characteristic is that there is usually emotion in the space. Whether it's visible or not, it's there. I remember the first time, it's probably the first time, certainly the time I remember that I cried in front of my boss. I was traveling. He'd rang me up to have a phone call about some feedback. Something had gone wrong while I was away that I hadn't really looked after. He was giving feedback. And it hurt. I was tired. I was upset about the feedback. It felt a little unjust. And I burst into tears. Now, I don't know if any of you have cried at work, but typically it drives up feelings of shame and embarrassment. I was mortified. I did not want to be crying on that phone call. I thought it was the exact opposite of what I needed to do. And yet, I'll never forget what he said to me in that moment. Because he said, it's fine. It shows you care. And he was right. He was totally right. So it's an example of the being emotion space. It's an example of a conversation that made a difference because that stayed with me. It was a step change in the relationship. It moved our relationship forward. Yes, it did feel difficult. And there was definitely emotion. And the emotion can come from fear or shame or embarrassment or simply from the upset around a conflict or a disagreement. Could be anger. The final characteristic of these conversations is that they sustain. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that we remember them. We reflect on them. They stay with us. Whatever it is we've got from them, they stay there. Great example. That conversation was probably 8 years ago now, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I still think about it because they shift our thinking. Now, my guess is that everybody here can remember a conversation like that, whether it's recently or a long time ago. My guess is also that everybody here can think of a conversation that they've been maybe thinking about having, but avoiding or not yet got round to. Maybe it's in a work context, maybe it's with a family member or with a friend. Hold that thought. Because for the next part, we're actually going to look at some very practical tips about having these conversations. because I believe that these are the important ones. They're the ones that make a difference. If you can think of that conversation now, the chances are you've also spent time ruminating on it. So it's the opportunity to actually have the conversation and move forwards. So I have five things I want to share, which are suggestions and tips, if you like, to go about having conversations that make a difference. So first one, know your why and say it out loud. So what I mean is be clear on your intention. What's the goal for you in actually having this conversation? What difference will it make for you? How will it move you forwards? And if you can be out loud about that, it's very powerful for the person or the people you're having the conversation with. When we get nervous, we tend to hide behind our language. We do a lot of preamble. We do a lot of explaining because we're sort of uncomfortable about actually saying the thing we want to say. But it can be a very powerful start to a conversation. I've done it a lot with feedback conversations, to actually start and say, my intention is to give you some feedback in support of your growth and development. It sets the tone. It creates a space where everybody understands why they're there. Brené Brown puts it beautifully. She says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. I always think of that in these conversations. My second tip, invite the other person into the conversation and actually create a shared goal. So don't do conversations to people. Don't do that. That's when we're back at that quote at the start, where conversations are really a broadcast or a one-way monologue that there is a witness to. Actually, there's an opportunity to invite them in and see what's in it for them. You're clear on your goal for the conversation and why you want to have it, but what if they're also clear in their goal for themselves? Remember also that they don't know this conversation is happening. So like, you've planned this, you've thought about it, but when they come into it, it's probably a surprise to them. So giving them space to talk about and reflect on what could they get out of the conversation really helps you set off where you're not in conflict. You're actually working on, you've both got a goal for this. So that's number 2, invite them into the conversation and create that shared goal. Third tip, expect and welcome emotion. How many people in any environment actually expect it and welcome it, whether it's professional or personal? We tend to shy away from it. It's uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with it if the other person gets emotional, right? But to my story earlier, it's a sign that people care. So there's nothing wrong. It's normal. It's human. And when we expect it, it's much easier to be with. So breathe, ground yourself. Think about the things you can do to stay present and just stay breathing and stay in the conversation when it happens. Check in with them. What do they need? So be a human with them. Be connected. And again, remember, this is a surprise. This is a sort of new conversation to them. It's normal that with surprise can also come some emotion. So if we can expect the emotion and welcome it into the conversation as a sign everyone cares, that's very powerful. Tip number 4, listen more than you speak. I mean, this is generally a conversation tip or really a tip for life, but particularly in these conversations where you want to make a difference, conversations that matter. And listen so as to understand. And many of us spend our time sometimes listening just to wait for a break in the conversation so we can make our next point. Yeah, don't do that. Really listen, really hear what the other person is saying. You might notice often when we're uncomfortable, we speak more, we speak faster. It becomes this sort of monologue, which, aside from the fact that's not a conversation, is also much harder for the other person to hear and take in. Again, they didn't know this was coming. They need time to process their thoughts, to reflect, and to respond. So give them that time and that space. Don't be afraid of the silence. Listen to that too. It's someone taking it in. So listen more than you speak. The final tip I have for you, number 5, is look for where you agree and build from there. So often in these difficult conversations or challenging conversations, it feels like we're not on the same page. It feels like we don't have common ground. Actually, we do, more than we think. But if we can even find one area where we can create agreement about what we're going to do, what actions we're going to take, and we're listening for that, that allows us to move forwards. It's very common that we listen and we hear what we don't agree on more than what we do. But when we have that nugget, we can build out from there. And often some of the issues that actually feel very gnarly can kind of work themselves out from that base. So I want to finish with actually just sharing a quick story that's an example of this. There were 2 clients I worked with. It was the founder, who was the CEO, and her managing director of a small consulting company. Both brilliant, competent, committed, passionate women working very hard at this, within this business. But they were spending a lot of time second guessing each other about what was wrong or what was missing, or how they were kind of missing each other. And they were so busy trying not to step on each other's toes or take over or be sort of power grabbing, that there were tons of things either being missed or being duplicated, things they were both trying to do. And they were both pretty stressed and pretty unhappy. And it's because they'd been unwilling to have the conversation about their relationship, about what was working, about what was not working, because it's uncomfortable. It's much easier to talk about what we want to do or the actions we have to take. So I worked with them to actually have that conversation. We sat in a room and I helped them have it, to say the things they'd been unwilling to say, to express their fears, to express their frustrations, to express their doubts, their shared hopes, so that they actually understood each other. And the result was so much more trust in the relationship. They had a common vision. They had a clarity on their roles and how they work together, how they partner effectively. And the result for the business growth took off. And more than that, their team started to behave differently because they were willing to have those conversations with each other. The team started to be willing to have those kind of conversations too. So this really can have a ripple effect. So I leave you with a challenge. The challenge is that conversation you had in mind that you're maybe thinking, oh, I should probably talk to that person about that. Go and have it. Use these tips. Be willing to go and give it a go. I have a firm belief that there is no mess that you can create in a conversation that you can't also clear up in a conversation. So if we're willing, get out there, have the conversation, and actually go and make a difference. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yay, virtual round of applause for Sarah. Thank you so much. You shared so much amazing insight there. I really loved the whole know your why going into the conversation. And of course, state your intention. Here's what I want from this conversation. But of course, inviting someone in to understand what they would like from a conversation. And that key word, listening more than you speak, and not listening just so you can make your point, actually being present with that and listening, I thought was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah, for stepping in and doing this and for opening with such strength and such power. And again, thank you for sharing your insights. Brilliant stuff.